Hi, everyone. My name is Gabby Davis. Thank you for coming to my presentation. In this study, we were looking to evaluate potential influences on treatment willingness in individuals with high levels of restricted eating symptoms, which is a predictor for a diagnosis of anorexia nervosa. So the first thing I wanted to do was to go over what anorexia nervosa is and the criteria for diagnosis. And so anorexia nervosa is characterized by routine starvation to the point of emaciation, an immense fear of gaining weight, and a continued denial of the seriousness or danger of low body weight. Additionally, anorexia nervosa has the highest mortality rate of any mental disorder, with a rate of 5.1 deaths per 1,000 people each year. And then finally, only 40% of individuals who meet criteria for any eating disorder diagnosis seek any form of treatment, with individuals diagnosed with anorexia nervosa restricting type being the least likely, followed by individuals diagnosed with anorexia nervosa binge purge subtype. So we were really curious as to why these individuals avoided treatment at such a high rate. And we found a lot of potential reasons in the literature, the first two of which being denial or avoidance. So as mentioned in the criteria for anorexia nervosa, some individuals do engage in denial of their behaviors. So they deny that they have a problem with their weight or with food or with their bodies. And so they don't really see a point in seeking treatment. And then finally, what we know about individuals with anorexia nervosa is that they tend to engage in a pattern of avoidance behaviors. So not only are they avoiding treatment, but they're also avoiding food intake, they're avoiding certain types of foods, they're avoiding their emotions. And so we thought that this fit really well into the pattern of their avoidance behaviors. The next reason that we found why individuals may avoid treatment is behavioral reinforcement, which ties in really well with the next reason that we found, which is the response to stress and anxiety in these individuals. And so looking at this graphic here, we can see that if an individual is with anorexia nervosa is feeling these negative emotions like guilt or shame, they may be inclined to engage in restriction or other eating disorder behaviors to provide themselves with brief relief from that anxiety or from those emotions. And because they do experience this relief from their eating disorder behaviors, the behavior is reinforced. So they learn that if they are feeling uncomfortable in their emotions, or if they are, if they want to avoid engaging in something that they don't want to engage in, they can simply engage in eating disorder behaviors, experience that relief from anxiety, and the cycle continues to perpetuate itself. And then finally, individuals with anorexia nervosa have been demonstrated to have altered information processing, particularly with visual information processing. So this has been demonstrated while individuals with anorexia nervosa are reading or while they're looking at advertisements, for example. And so going on about advertising, so advertisements are one of the primary ways that the public learns about eating disorders and treatment. But what we notice in evaluating advertisements directed towards eating disorder treatment and recovery is that they have a pattern of using triggering imagery and language. And I do have examples at the end of this presentation. Please take this as a trigger warning. They can be kind of challenging to look at. And so what we mean by if something is triggering to an individual with anorexia nervosa or with any eating disorder is that if an individual were to view the stimulus, they would be more inclined to engage in eating disorder behaviors as opposed to viewing a more neutral stimulus. And so some examples of some triggering imagery could be thin or overweight bodies, images of food, the National Eating Disorder Association logo. And then for examples of triggering language, words like healthy, thin, recovery, names of their disorders and their behaviors, so anorexia nervosa and restriction, for example. And what we found in the literature is that the way a stimulus is framed is associated with individuals' perceptions of that stimulus and their stress response to that stimulus. And so we wanted to take this a step further. And so what do I mean by how a stimulus is framed? So in this particular study, we are referring to gain and loss frames. And so a gain frame focuses on the rewards or the benefits of a behavior, whereas loss frames focus on the consequences or otherwise negative aspects of a behavior. So just as an example, here's a diagram depicting both frames. So on the left, we have an advertisement that says, "Don't eat candy or you'll get fat." So don't eat candy, that's the behavior that they're trying to encourage, or you'll get fat, that's the consequence. So that is a loss frame. And then on the right, it says eat fruit and be slim. So it is highlighting the benefit of eating fruit, becoming more slim. So that is a gain frame advertisement. And what these authors in particular noted is that while the public generally prefers gain frames and generally responds more favorably to them, experts in the fields of advertising and in healthcare tend to prefer utilizing more loss frames. And so the question that we wanted to answer with this study was what would lead to the highest amount of treatment willingness for individuals with high restricted eating symptoms. And so we thought for these individuals, being placed in a gain frame condition would lead to both more favorable attitudes toward the advertisements and an increase in treatment willingness. And so to test this, we recruited 75 undergraduates who were predominantly female and predominantly white. They were about 19 years old, and they had a mean BMI of 24.23. We thought it was really important to recruit from the general population because these advertisements are not specifically targeted at people who have already received a diagnosis of any eating disorder or who are already in treatment or who have already been through treatment. But we are also trying to include those individuals who are struggling with their eating disorder symptoms on their own and who may need encouragement to pursue treatment or to seek help. And so that is why we decided not to use a clinical sample, but to use undergraduates instead. And so for our measure of restricted eating symptoms, we used the eating attitudes test. And the eating attitudes test was completed as part of a prior study, and then we recruited from those participants for the current study. And so we had 22 participants meeting the clinical threshold on the eating attitudes test, which would suggest further diagnostic testing to see if this individual had an eating disorder. And then on the items measuring restricted eating, we had 32 participants scoring above the mean. And so these 32 participants were our high restricted eating symptoms group. So participants were randomly assigned to view a series of 4 filler advertisements, and then either the gain frame or the loss frame advertisements regarding treatment willingness, or regarding eating disorder treatment that you've seen here. And so this is our gain frame advertisement. We wanted to avoid as much triggering imagery and language as we possibly could, but we still wanted the purpose of the advertisement to be clear to the participants. So you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner, we decided to include the NIDA logo. And then at the bottom, we have a statement directly tying this advertisement to eating disorders. Again, this was just because we wanted to avoid triggering anybody, but we didn't want the purpose to be lost on our participants. So we had our participants fill out a survey of 5 questions, 4 of which were combined into a single attitude score. And then our final question was our measure of treatment willingness. So we asked participants how likely they would be to do the behavior in the advertisement after viewing it. So in this instance, how likely would it be that you would pursue treatment after viewing this advertisement? And then finally, after reviewing all 5 advertisements, we asked participants to fill out the positive and negative affect schedule as a measure of negative affect. And so for our preliminary results, looking at the effects of restricted eating symptoms and condition on attitudes, we found a significant effect of condition on attitudes. So participants in the gain frame condition were significantly more likely to have better attitudes than those in the loss frame condition. And looking at the effects and the interaction of the same 2 variables on treatment willingness, we did not find anything significant. And then looking at the effects of the same 2 variables on negative affect, we didn't find anything quite significant, but the effect of restricted eating symptoms on negative affect was trending towards significance. So if potentially in a future study we want to look at that a little bit more, maybe we could recruit from a clinical population where we can find individuals who have consistently high levels of restricted eating symptoms. And so we decided to do some exploratory analyses. And so we thought that maybe instead of looking like this, or the relationship between the variables looking something like this, we thought that maybe they could look either like a moderation or mediation on the left or a moderation on the right. And so these were our hypotheses for these 2 models. And so for our mediation, what we're looking at is the relationship between each of the variables on an individual basis. So just to break this graphic down for you. If we're just looking at the relationship between condition and attitudes toward advertisements, we see that there's a significant negative relationship. Because gain was coded as 0, that is our negative value, but this negative relationship suggests that the variables move in opposite directions. So in the gain frame condition, which is 0, you are more likely to have higher or better attitudes towards advertisements. So the variables are moving in opposite directions. And then when looking at attitudes toward advertisements and treatment willingness, we see that there's a significant positive relationship. So if you have better attitudes toward advertisements, you're more likely to have higher treatment willingness as well. And so to see if this mediation is successful or is significant, we look to the indirect effect. And so what the indirect effect tells us is that is whether the presence of attitudes towards advertisements in this model significantly improves or increases or affects the relationship between condition and treatment willingness. And so we look to our indirect effect, we see that 0 is not included in our confidence interval, so we can conclude that attitudes toward advertisements is a significant mediator in the relationship between condition and treatment willingness. So just to go over this one more time, if you're in the gain frame condition, you are more likely to have more favorable attitudes, and thus you're more likely to have better treatment willingness. And then for our moderation, let me just orient you to this graph right here. So look at my laser pointer. So on the x-axis down here, we have attitudes. On the y-axis here, we have treatment willingness. The green line right here is the gain frame condition, and the blue line right here is the loss frame condition. And so what we see in this moderation is that regardless of condition, if participants had low attitudes toward the advertisements, they were more likely to have low treatment willingness. And then conversely, if participants were to have high attitudes and more favorable attitudes toward the advertisements, they were more likely to have higher levels of treatment willingness as well. And so what this is telling us is that while there may have been a relationship between condition and treatment willingness, regardless of attitudes, the presence of attitudes in this analysis amplifies or strengthens that relationship. And so as we can see, again, with low attitudes and low treatment willingness, regardless of condition, if you have low attitudes, you're going to have low treatment willingness. And then when considering attitudes as a moderator, we see that relationship greatly increase. And so what does all this mean? So both our results from our mediation and our moderation suggest that more favorable attitudes lead to more treatment willingness. And so it may be more beneficial for advertisements to try to evoke positive emotions or a positive attitude toward the advertisement rather than a negative one. So maybe instead of using fear or shock to try and get your advertisement's purpose to succeed, maybe you could try and frame the advertisement in a way that would make someone feel empowered or make them feel hopeful. And hopefully that would improve the efficacy of that advertisement. What we know from our research and from the literature is that gain frames tend to be the ones to evoke these more positive emotions and attitudes compared to loss frames. And so our study adds support to the literature, suggesting that we shift from a more loss frame dominated advertising market to more gain frame advertising. And it seems that we're already moving in that direction. So last year, Instagram and Nita teamed up for this advertisement campaign titled "Come As You Are, Hindsight is 2020." And so in this campaign video, they had 3 overweight individuals talking about their struggles with body image, with body acceptance. And they acknowledged the pain that eating disorders and body dysmorphia can cause, but this wasn't the focus of the video. The focus of the video and the majority of the video was focused on really being comfortable in your body and accepting your body for what it is, accepting that there's beauty and diversity. And so this was definitely more of a gain frame advertisement compared to previous advertisements that we've seen from Nita and from other advertising companies. So we would just encourage that companies continue to move in this direction and continue to release more gain frame advertisements to hopefully increase the efficacy of their mission. And so that is all that I have. Again, I'm going to be showing some pretty triggering advertisements just in case anybody has any questions or if anybody is wondering what these advertisements look like. So again, this is just a trigger warning. And then obviously I'd be happy to take questions afterwards. So there are my references, and then the triggering advertisements are going to pop up in 3, 2, 1. There they are. Okay. Thank you all. I would be glad to take questions now.